The rain had finally stopped, but Lady Margaret Ashford's travelling cloak was still damp when she arrived at Thornfield Park. She stood in the entrance hall, watching water drip from her hem onto marble so pristine it reflected the chandelier above like a mirror. The contrast between her shabby appearance and the house's opulence made shame twist in her stomach, a feeling that had become her constant companion in the 18 months since her father's death. The entrance hall alone was larger than the remaining habitable rooms of her father's estate combined. Gilt-framed mirrors lined the walls between portraits of aristocratic ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her bedraggled progress across the checkered floor. Crystal chandeliers hung at intervals down the long corridor, each one probably worth more than everything Margaret still owned. The ceiling soared 3 stories above, decorated with elaborate plasterwork depicting classical scenes of triumph and glory, a stark reminder of the world she'd once belonged to, but could no longer claim. "His Grace will see you now." The butler's voice was carefully neutral, but Margaret caught the flicker of something in his eyes before he turned away. Pity, perhaps, or curiosity about why the daughter of an earl was here begging for a position as a governess. She'd heard the whispers from the footman as she'd waited, barely concealed speculation about her circumstance, her desperation, whether she'd actually be hired or sent away like so many others before her. She followed him through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. More portraits lined these walls, generations of Thornfields staring down with expressions ranging from benign satisfaction to stern disapproval. Margaret recognized a few from her days in society. The 3rd Duke, who'd been master of the hunt when her father was young. The 4th Duke, whose legendary parties had scandalized London for decades. Various duchesses in their finery, dripping with jewels that probably now sat in vaults somewhere in this enormous house. The study door opened to reveal a room that smelled of leather, tobacco, and old money. The particular scent of masculine privilege that Margaret remembered from her father's better days. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked more decorative than read. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, the mantel adorned with a clock that ticked with ponderous authority. Heavy velvet drapes in deep burgundy-framed tall windows that overlooked manicured gardens, currently grey with winter rain. Behind an enormous mahogany desk, a piece of furniture so substantial it could probably survive a siege, sat Sebastian Thornfield, 6th Duke of Thornfield. His dark head was bent over a ledger, his pen moving with precise measured strokes. He wore no jacket, only a waistcoat over his white shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows in a way that should have made him look casual, but somehow only emphasized the controlled power in his frame. He didn't look up. Margaret waited. The clock ticked. Rain pattered against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Still Sebastian wrote, each stroke of his pen deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world, and she had none at all. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, 30. Margaret's cheeks burned with humiliation. This was deliberate, she realized. A demonstration of power. A reminder that she was here as a supplicant, that her time meant nothing compared to his. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute, he set down his pen with deliberate precision. The sound of it touching the desk seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Lady Margaret Ashford. His voice was deep and cool as winter stone, utterly devoid of warmth. Daughter of the late Earl of Ashford, currently residing in what remains of your father's estate, Ashford Manor in Hertfordshire, correct? Yes, Your Grace. Which I understand is mortgaged to the hilt and scheduled for foreclosure within 3 months. Your father's debts amount to approximately £4,000, with creditors including the Bank of England, various tradesmen in London, and a rather substantial sum owed to Lord Pembroke for gambling losses incurred over the course of several years. Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks, but she kept her chin high. Your Grace is remarkably well informed about my private affairs. It's my business to be informed about anyone entering my household. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and Margaret felt the impact like a physical blow. Sebastian Thornfield was handsome in the way of classical sculpture. All sharp planes and aristocratic angles that looked as though they'd been carved from marble by an artist who valued precision over. His eyes were dark as obsidian, fringed with thick black lashes that should have softened his features, but somehow only made him more intimidating. His mouth was a firm line that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile, perhaps had never known how. High cheekbones, a strong jaw with just the faintest shadow of stubble, a nose that was aquiline and aristocratic. He was, Margaret estimated, perhaps 32 or 33, with the kind of presence that made the enormous room feel suddenly smaller, as though all the air had been pulled toward him by some invisible force. He wore authority like other men wore coats, so naturally that it seemed woven into his very being. "You come highly recommended by Lady Pembroke," he continued, his tone suggesting this was a mark against her rather than in her favour. "She writes that you're well educated, accomplished in all the necessary arts, and capable of instructing my ward in deportment, music, languages, and literature. She also mentions," he glanced at a letter on his desk, "that you have a particularly fine hand at drawing, that you read Latin and French with fluency, and that you're patient with children. Lady Pembroke is very kind. Lady Pembroke is sentimental and easily manipulated by sob stories. However, she's not entirely without judgment, and she assures me you're not a complete waste of time. So I'm willing to grant you an interview, though I should warn you that my standards are considerably higher than hers." Margaret bit the inside of her cheek to keep from responding to the insult. She needed this position, needed it, with a desperation that woke her at night, with her heart hammering and her sheets soaked with cold sweat, visions of the workhouse dancing behind her eyelids. "I'm grateful for the opportunity you're—" "I haven't finished." The words cracked like a whip, sharp and commanding. Margaret's mouth snapped shut. Sebastian leaned back in his chair with the careless grace of a man accustomed to absolute authority, his long fingers steepling beneath his chin. "Lady Charlotte is 7 years old. She became my ward 2 years ago when my brother and his wife perished in a carriage accident. She has been difficult since their deaths." The word difficult emerged with a particular emphasis that suggested a wealth of frustration behind it. "She's had 3 governesses in the past year," Sebastian continued. "Miss Thornton lasted 6 months before departing in tears, claiming Charlotte was ungovernable. Miss Peters managed only 3 months before declaring the position impossible. Miss Bradford, the most recent, left after precisely 2 weeks, stating that no amount of money was worth the aggravation." He paused, letting this sink in. Each woman came with excellent references. Each was experienced, educated, and ostensibly capable. Each failed spectacularly. "So I must ask you, Lady Margaret, what makes you think you'll succeed where they could not?" Margaret drew a careful breath. This was the moment. She could be demure, claim she would simply try her best, promise obedience to his rules, or she could be honest. "Perhaps, Your Grace," she said carefully, "the child requires understanding rather than merely discipline. She's lost both her parents in tragic circumstances. Surely she needs—" "Surely," Sebastian interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous softness that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. "You are not presuming to lecture me on the raising of my own ward, a woman who arrives at my door desperate for any position that will keep her from the workhouse." The words struck like a slap. Margaret felt them land in her chest, sharp and cruel and designed to wound. Her hands clenched in the folds of her damp skirt, her nails biting into her palms hard enough to leave crescents in the skin. She should apologize. She should lower her eyes and accept whatever crumbs he offered. She should remember her place, that she was no longer an earl's daughter with the luxury of pride, but a desperate woman whose choices were narrowing by the day. The creditors had given her until March. After that, Ashford Manor would be seized and sold. She'd have nothing. No home, no income, nowhere to go except perhaps to distant cousins, who'd made it abundantly clear they had no interest in supporting a penniless relation. The workhouse loomed like a spectre in her nightmares, with its grey walls and greyer future, where gentlewomen learned what happened when pride became unaffordable. But she had been raised an earl's daughter, educated by the finest governesses and tutors London could provide. Her father, for all his faults, had instilled in her a sense of dignity that apparently ran deeper than necessity. "I beg your Grace's pardon," she said, her voice steady despite the fury and humiliation burning in her chest. "However, if we are to be clear with one another, and I believe we should be, then allow me to state my position plainly." Sebastian's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only sign of surprise he allowed himself. No one, his expression suggested, spoke to him, certainly not desperate gentlewomen begging for employment. "I am not a trained governess, Margaret," her words precise and measured. "I have not attended any academy for such instruction. I am a gentlewoman who has fallen on difficult circumstances through no fault of my own. My father's gambling debts and poor investments have left me in a position I never anticipated. I am willing to serve as companion and instructor to Lady Charlotte, because circumstances require it, and because I genuinely believe I can help a grieving child." She paused, meeting his dark eyes directly. "But I will not be treated as something less than human, simply because I need employment. I will not grovel or scrape, or pretend to be less intelligent than I am. And I will not stand silent if I believe a child in my care is being harmed by methods that ignore her emotional needs in favor of rigid discipline." The silence that followed was absolute. The clock seemed to tick louder. The rain against the windows sounded like applause or condemnation. Sebastian's eyes had narrowed to slits of obsidian ice, his expression carved from granite. "You have extraordinary audacity," he said softly, his voice like silk over steel, "for someone in your position." "Aye, and you have extraordinary arrogance," Margaret replied before she could stop herself. "For someone who's driven away 3 governesses in a year. Perhaps the problem isn't the women you've hired, Your Grace. Perhaps it's you." She watched his face darken like a thundercloud and braced herself for immediate dismissal. This was it. She'd thrown away her only chance at security because she couldn't control her tongue, couldn't swallow her pride long enough to secure the position. But instead of ordering her out, Sebastian did something unexpected. One corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile. Margaret suspected Sebastian Thornfield had forgotten how those worked, if he'd ever known. But it was something, a crack in the armour, however small. "Very well, Lady Margaret." His voice was dangerously quiet, but there was something new in it now. Interest, perhaps, or challenge. "You may have your trial period. 1 month, £20 per annum, paid quarterly. You will have a room in the East Wing, take your meals with the upper servants, and report to me weekly on Charlotte's progress." £20. The number hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. It was an insult, pure and simple. A London governess of any competence could command £40, sometimes £50 per annum. Even country positions typically paid £30. £20 was what you paid a scullery maid or a junior footman. He was testing her, seeing if her pride would overcome her need, waiting for her to refuse so he could dismiss her without having to acknowledge that he'd been intrigued by her defiance. Margaret drew a careful breath. She could refuse, could tell him exactly what he could do with his £20 and his arrogant assumption, could walk out with her dignity intact and her future in ruins, or she could accept, could swallow this particular humiliation in exchange for a roof over her head and time to figure out her next move. £20 was better than nothing, and if she proved herself, perhaps she could negotiate better terms. "I accept," she said quietly, hating how the words tasted. "On one condition." Sebastian's eyebrows rose again. "You're hardly in a position to set conditions. Nevertheless, I have one. If I succeed where the others failed, if Charlotte shows measurable improvement in her studies and her behaviour, I want your Grace's word that you'll increase my salary to a fair rate for the work performed." For a long moment, Sebastian simply stared at her. Then slowly he nodded. "If you succeed where 3 experienced governesses failed, I will increase your compensation to £45 per annum. But Lady Margaret, I should warn you, I have very high standards for what constitutes success." Charlotte must demonstrate not only academic progress, but also improvement in deportment, obedience, and emotional control. Anything less, and you'll be dismissed at the end of your trial month. Do we have an understanding? We do. Excellent. You will begin tomorrow. Mrs. Winters will show you to your quarters. He'd already picked up his pen, his attention returning to his ledger as though she'd ceased to exist the moment their business was concluded. Margaret turned toward the door, then paused, some impulse she couldn't name making her speak. Your Grace? Yes? He didn't look up. Thank you for the opportunity. I shall endeavour to prove worthy of it. Now he did look up, his expression unreadable. Those obsidian eyes studied her face as though trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. See that you do, Lady Margaret. I have very little patience for disappointment, and even less for failure. The words weren't a threat exactly, more a statement of fact, delivered with the casual authority of someone who'd never had to explain himself or his expectations. But Margaret felt them settle over her like a weight nonetheless, as she followed Mrs. Winters, a stern-faced woman in her 50s with iron-grey hair and shrewd eyes, up the servants' stairs to the east wing. Margaret tried to catalogue everything she'd learned from the interview. Sebastian Thornfield was arrogant, cold, and deliberately cruel in his choice of words. He'd insulted her circumstances, her desperation, and her worth with surgical precision. He'd offered her a pittance for wages, clearly testing whether her pride would override her need. But he'd also listened to her arguments, had engaged with her challenges rather than simply dismissing her, had shown that flash of something, amusement, respect, when she'd stood up to him, and he'd made a bargain, succeed, and be fairly compensated, fail, and be dismissed. It was more than many employers would offer, and certainly more than Margaret had any right to expect given her complete lack of experience. Here we are, Mrs. Winters said, opening a door in a narrow corridor lined with similar doors. The east wing houses the upper servants and any governesses or companions. You'll be sharing a corridor with Miss Jenkins, His Grace's secretary's assistant, and Mrs. Moore, who manages the still room. The room was small but clean. A narrow bed with a serviceable quilt, a washstand with a chipped but functional basin and pitcher, a small wardrobe that would more than accommodate Margaret's meagre possessions, a single window that overlooked the kitchen gardens, currently grey and dormant in the December chill. It was a far cry from her bedroom at Ashford Manor, with its four-poster bed and silk hangings and views of the rose garden her mother had planted. But it was warm and dry and hers, which was more than she'd been certain of having a month from now. Supper is at 6 in the servants' hall, Mrs. Winters continued. Breakfast at 7, luncheon at 1. You'll take your meals with the upper servants, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Hartwell the butler, myself, and a few others. The lower servants eat at a separate table. Even here, Margaret thought, there was hierarchy. Even among servants there were those who ranked higher and those who ranked lower. It would have been amusing if it weren't so depressing. His Grace expects you to begin Charlotte's lessons at 9 tomorrow morning, Mrs. Winters said. The nursery is on the 3rd floor, east corner. Charlotte takes breakfast in the nursery at 8. You're welcome to join her there, or take your meal in the servants' hall, as you prefer. I'll join Charlotte, Margaret said. It will help her become accustomed to my presence. Something that might have been considered like approval flickered across Mrs. Winters's stern features. Very good, miss. Is there anything else you'll be needing? No, thank you. You've been very helpful. After the housekeeper departed, Margaret sank onto the narrow bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. She'd done it. She'd secured a position. She had a month to prove herself, to show Sebastian Thornfield that his arrogant dismissal of her worth had been premature. And if she succeeded, £45 per annum, enough to send money back to Ashford Manor, to pay off some of the smaller debts, to buy herself time to figure out a longer-term solution. If she failed, well, she'd be no worse off than she was now, except that she'd have wasted a month that could have been spent seeking other options. Margaret unpacked her few belongings, 3 serviceable dresses, her nightclothes, a few books she hadn't been able to bear parting with, and the miniature of her mother that was one of her last remaining treasures. As she hung her dresses in the small wardrobe, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion and worry. Her brown hair, once glossy and carefully styled, hung limp from the damp. Her dress, one of her better ones, but still clearly worn and outdated, hung on her frame, evidence of the weight she'd lost in recent months, when money for food had become scarce. She looked exactly like what she was, a desperate woman clinging to the last shreds of her former life. But her eyes, at least, still held fire, and her chin, when she lifted it, still showed the pride her father had sometimes called stubborn, and her mother had called dignified. 1 month, she said in her reflection. You can do anything for 1 month, even work for an arrogant, infuriating duke who thinks you're beneath his notice. The reflection didn't answer, but Margaret imagined she saw agreement in those shadowed eyes. Tomorrow, she would meet Charlotte. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of proving Sebastian Thornfield wrong about her. Tonight, she would rest, and she would try not to think about how his dark eyes had looked when he'd studied her face, or how her pulse had quickened when he'd leaned forward in his chair. All controlled power and aristocratic authority. She was here to work, to survive, to secure her future. She was absolutely not here to develop inappropriate feelings for her employer, no matter how compelling she found the rare moments when his cold facade cracked. Margaret climbed into the narrow bed, pulled the quilt up to her chin, and firmly told herself that she was grateful for this opportunity. She almost believed it. Margaret woke before dawn, her body still adjusted to the rhythms of Ashford Manor, where she'd been doing all her own cooking and cleaning for months. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The ceiling was wrong. The sounds were wrong. The quality of darkness was different. Then memory returned in a rush. Thornfield Park, the Duke's study, £20 per annum, 1 month to prove herself. She dressed quickly in one of her serviceable gowns, a grey wool that had seen better days, but was clean and neatly mended, and made her way through the still sleeping house toward the nursery. The corridors were dimly lit by early morning light, filtering through tall windows, casting long shadows that made the portraits seem to watch her pass with disapproving eyes. The nursery occupied a suite of rooms on the 3rd floor, tucked away in the east corner, just as Mrs. Winters had indicated. Margaret paused outside the door, suddenly nervous. Everything depended on the next few weeks. Everything depended on her ability to reach a grieving 7-year-old that 3 experienced governesses had failed to help. She knocked softly. No answer. Margaret waited a moment, then carefully opened the door. The nursery was spacious, much larger than her own childhood nursery had been, but oddly oppressive despite its size. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light from tall windows that should have made the room bright and cheerful. The furniture was expensive but joyless, a small desk positioned for maximum discomfort, chairs that looked more suited to a drawing room than a child's playroom, shelves lined with leather-bound books that appeared untouched. There were no toys visible, no dolls or hobby horses or building blocks, no drawings pinned to the walls, no evidence of play or creativity or childhood joy. It looked, Margaret thought with a sinking heart, like a prison dressed up as a schoolroom. A small figure huddled in the window seat, half hidden behind the heavy velvet drapes. Charlotte was barely visible, just a glimpse of blonde hair and a grey dress that seemed to swallow her small frame. "Lady Charlotte," Margaret said gently, not approaching. "My name is Lady Margaret Ashford. I'm to be your new companion and governess." The child didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. But Margaret saw the small fingers tighten on the worn rag doll she held. Margaret moved closer, slowly, and settled herself on the far end of the window seat, careful to leave plenty of space between them. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked out the window at the gardens below, bare and brown in December, but with good bones visible beneath the winter dormancy. "Those gardens must be beautiful in summer," she observed, as though talking to herself. "I can see the rose beds from here. And is that a knot garden, with the geometric patterns? Those are quite rare." Your family must have very skilled gardeners. Still nothing from Charlotte. But the child had turned slightly, just enough that Margaret could see her profile now. She was lovely, in a delicate way. Fine features, large eyes that seemed too old for her face, skin so pale it was almost translucent. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe braid that looked painfully tight. She looked like a little ghost, Margaret thought, or like a child who'd learned to make herself as small and invisible as possible. "I've heard you're very clever," Margaret continued in that same conversational tone, "that you can already read quite well, and know your sums better than most children twice your age. That's remarkable. I didn't learn to read properly until I was 8, and my arithmetic was always hopeless. I still can't multiply 9 times 7 without counting on my fingers." A flicker of interest in those two old eyes. Charlotte's head turned slightly more. "It's 63, she said, her voice barely audible. 9 times 7 is 63. "Is it really? How clever of you to know that." Margaret smiled. "I shall have to remember that, though I'll probably forget again by tomorrow. My memory for numbers is dreadful." Silence settled between them again, but it was a different quality of silence now, waiting rather than refusing. "I wonder," Margaret said, as though the thought had just occurred to her, "if you might help me with something. You see, I'm quite new here, and this house is enormous. I'm terribly afraid I shall get lost trying to find my way about. Do you think you might show me around? I should be very grateful, particularly if you could show me where the library is. I was told it's quite magnificent." For a long moment, nothing. Then Charlotte's voice, small and uncertain. "You'll leave anyway." "They all do." Margaret's heart clenched. "Who leaves, sweetheart?" "Everyone." The word was flat, emotionless, recited like a lesson learned too well. "Mama left, Papa left, Miss Thornton left, Miss Peters, Miss Bradford, Miss Warren before that. They all leave. Uncle Sebastian says I'm difficult, that I drive them away. He's probably right. He's always right about everything." "Oh, my dear child." Margaret slid closer, slowly, telegraphing every movement. "You haven't driven anyone away, Charlotte. You've simply been very sad. And sadness sometimes makes us behave in ways we don't quite mean to. That's perfectly natural when you've lost people you love. Uncle Sebastian says there's no excuse for poor behaviour," Charlotte recited, still in that same flat tone, "that I must learn discipline and self-control. Those feelings are no justification for rudeness or disobedience." Your uncle," Margaret said, choosing each word like stepping stones across treacherous water, "loves you very much. But even people who love us can be wrong sometimes, especially about feelings." Charlotte's head swiveled toward her so fast that Margaret almost flinched. The child's eyes were wide with something that looked like shock. "You can't say that. Uncle Sebastian doesn't like being wrong." "Well, that's something we have in common," Margaret said lightly. "I don't care much for being wrong either. None of us do, really. But we're all wrong sometimes, whether we like it or not. Even dukes. Especially dukes, perhaps, because they're so accustomed to everyone agreeing with them that they forget other perspectives might have merit." The ghost of a smile touched Charlotte's lips. "You're peculiar. I've been called worse. Just yesterday, in fact, your uncle implied I was desperate and beneath his notice, which I suppose is true, but it's not terribly polite to say so." Charlotte's eyes widened further. "He said that to you?" "In so many words, yes. Along with several other unflattering observations about my circumstances and my presumption in daring to have opinions about your education." "What did you do?" "I told him he was arrogant, and that perhaps the reason he'd driven away 3 governesses wasn't their inadequacy, but his own approach to your care." Charlotte's mouth fell open. "You said that? To Uncle Sebastian?" "I did. I probably shouldn't have, but I've discovered that being poor and desperate has one small advantage. I have very little left to lose, which makes me remarkably bold." Margaret paused. "He didn't dismiss me on the spot, which I consider a minor victory. He must have been very angry. Furious, I suspect, though he hides it rather well behind all that aristocratic reserve." Margaret studied Charlotte's face, saw genuine interest there for the first time. Now, about that tour of the house. I'm particularly interested in finding the library. I was told it has books from floor to ceiling. Charlotte hesitated, clearly torn between habitual withdrawal and curiosity. Finally, curiosity won. She uncurled from her defensive position, setting the rag doll carefully aside. She was tiny, Margaret realized with a pang. Far too thin for a child of 7, all sharp angles and prominent bones. The grey dress hung on her like a sack, several sizes too large, making her look even smaller and more fragile. It does have books from floor to ceiling, Charlotte said quietly, a hint of animation creeping into her voice. And there's a sliding ladder that goes all the way to the top, and a globe as tall as I am, with all the countries marked on it. Uncle Sebastian sometimes shows me where he's travelled. Then I absolutely must see it. Will you show me? Charlotte nodded slowly, then slipped off the window seat. She was barefoot, Margaret noticed, her small feet pale against the dark carpet. I should put on shoes first. Uncle Sebastian says it's improper to go about barefoot. Probably wise. Though between you and me, I rather like being barefoot. There's something wonderfully free about it. Charlotte looked up at her with those two solemn eyes. You say things other governesses never said. Is that good or bad? I don't know yet. Charlotte moved to a small wardrobe and extracted a pair of buttoned boots that looked stiff and uncomfortable. But it's different, and the difference is interesting. As Charlotte led her through the corridors of Thornfield Park, chattering quietly about the house's history and pointing out various portraits and features, Margaret felt that weight in her chest grow heavier. This bright, wounded little girl needed so much more than rigid discipline and structured lessons. She needed warmth, laughter, permission to be a child, rather than a miniature adult constantly monitored for infractions. She needed someone to see past the difficult behavior to the grieving, terrified child underneath. But providing those things would mean directly defying Sebastian's explicit instructions, would mean challenging his authority and methods at every turn, would almost certainly result in her dismissal long before her trial month ended. Margaret looked down at Charlotte's small hand, which had gradually crept into hers as they walked, and made a decision that would change everything. Some battles were worth fighting, even against a duke, even when you had nothing but conviction and stubbornness to fight with. The library, when they reached it, was indeed magnificent. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with thousands of leather-bound volumes that gleamed in the morning light. The sliding ladder Charlotte had mentioned was actually quite beautiful, polished brass and dark wood, running on tracks that allowed it to traverse the entire length of one wall. The globe stood in the center of the room, mounted on an ornate wooden stand. It was indeed as tall as Charlotte, perhaps taller, with countries marked in various colors and tiny script labeling cities and mountain ranges and bodies of water. This is extraordinary, Margaret breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. Charlotte, you're so fortunate to have access to all of it. Have you read many of these? Charlotte shook her head. Uncle Sebastian says I must finish my lessons before I'm allowed to read for pleasure. And the lessons are always very long. By the time they're done, it's time for bed. What sort of lessons? Latin, French, mathematics, geography, history, music. Though I'm not very good at music. Miss Bradford said I had no natural talent and should focus my energies elsewhere. Margaret felt anger kindle in her chest. Well, Miss Bradford sounds like she was rather foolish. Music isn't about natural talent. It's about joy and expression. Anyone can learn to make music if they're taught with patience and encouragement. That's not what Miss Bradford said. She said some people simply aren't musical, and I should accept my limitations. Miss Bradford, Margaret said firmly, was wrong, and I intend to prove it. Would you like to learn to sing? Charlotte looked uncertain. Uncle Sebastian says my singing voice is adequate, but not exceptional. He says I should focus on accomplishments where I might actually excel. Your uncle, Margaret said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury, has opinions about a great many things. That doesn't make all those opinions correct. Now shall we start with something simple? Do you know any songs? Only hymns from church. And a lullaby my mother used to sing, but I don't remember all the words. Hymns are a perfectly good place to start. And as for your mother's lullaby, perhaps we can remember it together. Sometimes these things come back when we don't force them. Margaret settled onto one of the library's comfortable sofas and patted the seat beside her. Come sit. I'll teach you a song my mother taught me. It's about a skylark. Charlotte approached hesitantly, perching on the very edge of the sofa as though ready to flee at any moment. Margaret began to sing softly, a simple melody with words about a bird soaring free above the fields. By the second verse, Charlotte was listening with rapt attention. By the third, she was humming along tentatively. And by the fourth repetition, she was singing the words in a small, sweet voice that was actually quite lovely. There, Margaret said warmly when they finished. You see, you're perfectly musical. You just needed someone to teach you properly. Charlotte's face was glowing in a way Margaret suspected it hadn't in a very long time. Can we sing it again? We can sing it as many times as you like, though perhaps we should also look at some of these books. I'm curious what sorts of stories you enjoy. They spent the next hour exploring the library together. Charlotte showed Margaret the section on natural history, where there were beautiful illustrated volumes showing birds and butterflies and flowers. They found a collection of fairy tales with elaborate engravings that made Charlotte gasp with delight. They discovered a whole shelf devoted to adventure stories that the previous Duke had apparently collected. Uncle Sebastian says fairy tales are frivolous, Charlotte said wistfully, running her fingers over the gilt-edged pages of a particularly beautiful volume. He says I should focus on educational reading. Fairy tales are educational, Margaret countered. They teach us about courage and kindness and perseverance. They help us imagine possibilities beyond our immediate circumstances. I'd say that's quite educational indeed. May I read this one? Charlotte held up the book with barely concealed hope. I think you should read it. In fact, I think we should make it part of your lessons. We'll read together, and then we can discuss the stories. We'll practice your reading comprehension while enjoying ourselves. That seems like an efficient use of time, don't you think? Charlotte's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. You're very different from the other governesses. Is that a good thing? Yes, Charlotte said with more certainty than she'd shown all morning. I think it's a very good thing indeed. They were so absorbed in their exploration of the library that neither of them noticed Sebastian standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. Both of them jumped. Charlotte immediately dropped the book she'd been holding and stood at attention, her brief animation vanishing like smoke. Uncle Sebastian, she said, her voice once again flat and careful. I'm sorry. Lady Margaret asked to see the library, and I was showing her. It's quite all right, Charlotte, Sebastian said, his dark eyes fixed on Margaret rather than his ward. Lady Margaret and I should have a word, however. Why don't you return to the nursery? I'll send a maid up with your breakfast. Charlotte fled without another word, not even pausing to retrieve the fairy tale book she'd been so eager to read. When they were alone, Sebastian closed the library door with a quiet click that somehow sounded ominous. Lady Margaret, I was not aware I'd given you permission to begin lessons in the library. You gave me permission to begin Charlotte's education, Margaret replied, keeping her voice level. You didn't specify where those lessons should take place. The nursery is equipped as a schoolroom for a reason. The nursery is equipped as a prison, Margaret countered before she could stop herself. Heavy curtains blocking the light, uncomfortable furniture, not a single toy or drawing or evidence of childhood joy anywhere. Charlotte spends her days in that room like a convict serving a sentence. Sebastian's eyes went cold. That is an extraordinarily inappropriate characterization of my ward's living conditions. Is it? When was the last time you actually spent time in the nursery, not to check on Charlotte's progress or interrogate her about her lessons, but to actually observe the environment you've created for her? I created a structured educational environment appropriate for a duke's ward. You created a joyless box designed to produce a perfect little aristocratic automaton. Margaret took a step toward him, her own temper rising to match his. Charlotte is 7 years old. She's lost both parents. She's desperately lonely and sad. And you've surrounded her with rules and restrictions and criticism, while withholding the affection and understanding she desperately needs. You have been in this house for precisely 12 hours, Sebastian said, his voice dangerously soft. And you presume to tell me how to care for my own ward? Someone needs to, because what you're doing isn't working. 3 governesses have fled. Charlotte is miserable, and you're so wrapped up in your determination to maintain control that you can't see you're crushing a child's spirit in the process. The silence that followed was electric. Sebastian's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek. His hands curled into fists at his sides. For a moment, Margaret thought he might actually shout at her. Instead, he said with icy precision, "You're dismissed for the day. Return to your room and consider whether you wish to continue in this position. Because if you do, you will follow my instructions regarding Charlotte's education. You will conduct lessons in the nursery as the previous governesses did. You will focus on academic subjects and deportment, not fairy tales and singing. And you will remember that I am the Duke of Thornfield. You are my employee, and your opinions about my methods are neither requested nor welcome. Do I make myself clear?" Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. This was it, the moment where she could back down, apologize, promise obedience, or she could stand firm and almost certainly be dismissed immediately. She thought about Charlotte's face when they'd sung together, about the flash of joy when she'd held that fairy tale book, about the small hand that had crept into hers with such tentative trust. "Perfectly clear, Your Grace," Margaret said quietly. "And with all due respect, the answer is no." Sebastian's eyebrows shot up. "No, no. I will not conduct lessons exclusively in the nursery. I will not focus solely on rote academic subjects while ignoring Charlotte's emotional needs. And I will not stand silent while you damage a child through misguided attempts at control." Margaret drew a steadying breath. "You hired me for a 1-month trial. I accepted. During that month, I will educate Charlotte according to my best judgment of what she needs, not according to your rigid requirements. At the end of the month, you may dismiss me if you're unsatisfied, but until then, I will do what I believe is right for that child. You realize," Sebastian said softly, "that I could dismiss you right now, this instant. Have your belongings packed and you removed from the grounds before luncheon. You could, but you won't. And why is that?" "Because you're desperate," Margaret said bluntly. 3 governesses have failed. You're running out of options. And despite your arrogance and your rigid insistence on control, you love Charlotte. I saw it in your face just now when she jumped, and you immediately told her it was all right. You don't want to terrify her. You simply don't know any other way to parent her. Something flickered across Sebastian's face. Pain, perhaps, or recognition. His hands unclenched slowly. "You are remarkably presumptuous," he said finally. "I am remarkably honest. There's a difference." Margaret held his gaze. "Give me the month, Your Grace. Let me try my methods. If Charlotte is miserable, if she shows no improvement, dismiss me gladly, and I'll go without complaint. But if she thrives, if she starts to heal and learn and show the bright spirit I suspect is buried under all that grief and fear, then perhaps you'll acknowledge that rigid discipline isn't the only path to proper education." Sebastian studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded once. 1 month. "Your methods. But Lady Margaret," his voice dropped, "if you fail, if Charlotte is harmed in any way by your unconventional approach, you will leave this house immediately, and I will ensure that no family in England ever hires you as a governess again. Do we understand each other?" "We do." "Then get out of my sight before I change my mind." Margaret fled before he could do exactly that. But as she climbed the stairs to the nursery where Charlotte was undoubtedly waiting anxiously, she felt something unexpected blooming in her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close to it. She'd won her first battle against the Duke of Thornfield, and if she'd learned anything in the past 18 months of hardship and loss, it was that small victories could add up to something significant. Now she just had to prove that her methods would actually work. 3 weeks passed, and Thornfield Park began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. Charlotte started taking breakfast in the morning room with Victoria, the Dowager Duchess, rather than eating alone in the nursery. It had been Margaret's suggestion, made cautiously during her first formal report to Sebastian. Children are social creatures, she'd explained, standing in his study with her written account of Charlotte's progress in hand. Isolating her for meals reinforces her sense of being separate from the family, of being a burden rather than a beloved member of the household. Sebastian had looked sceptical. My mother rises late. Charlotte would need to adjust her schedule. Your mother rises at 8, which is perfectly reasonable for a 7-year-old to manage. And Victoria, Margaret caught herself. The Dowager Duchess has expressed interest in seeing more of Charlotte. She mentioned it to me yesterday when we encountered each other in the garden. My mother discussed this with you. She discussed many things with me, including her observation that you keep Charlotte at arm's length because you're afraid of losing her the way you lost your brother. Margaret had watched Sebastian's face shudder at that. She believes you're recreating the same cold, rigid environment your father imposed on you and your brother. And she wonders if you've noticed that it made neither of you particularly happy. Sebastian had gone very still. My mother says too much. Your mother loves you, and Charlotte, and she's worried you're repeating mistakes that caused you pain. There had been a long silence. Then, grudgingly, Charlotte may take breakfast with my mother if she wishes. I'll inform Victoria. That had been the first victory. The second came when Margaret quietly replaced Charlotte's severe grey dresses with lighter muslins in soft blues and rose colours that she'd commissioned from the village dressmaker, using her own meagre wages to pay for them. Sebastian had noticed during one of his increasingly frequent visits to observe lessons. Those are new dresses. They are. Charlotte was drowning in those grey things. They were several sizes too large and entirely unsuitable for a child. These fit properly and allow her to move freely during our outdoor lessons. Outdoor lessons, yes. We've been studying botany in the gardens. Charlotte is learning to identify plants, understand their growth cycles, and sketch them accurately. It combines science, art, and physical activity. Quite efficient, really. Sebastian had looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he'd simply nodded and returned his attention to watching Charlotte carefully draw a dormant rosebush, her small face scrunched in concentration. The third victory had been music. Charlotte had a sweet, clear voice that blossomed under encouragement. Margaret had her singing every day, simple folk songs, hymns, ballads. And slowly, tentatively, Charlotte had begun to remember her mother's lullaby. The words had come back in fragments over several days, until finally she could sing it all the way through without hesitation. The day that happened, Margaret looked up from the piano to find Sebastian standing in the doorway of the music room, his expression absolutely arrested. Charlotte saw him and stopped mid-verse, her animation immediately dampening. But Sebastian did something unexpected. He crossed the room and knelt beside his wife. "That was your mother's favourite song," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She used to sing it to you when you were a baby. I'd forgotten how it sounded." Charlotte's eyes welled with tears. "I thought I'd forgotten too, but Lady Margaret helped me remember." Sebastian had looked up at Margaret, something complicated and unguarded in his dark eye. "Thank you," he'd said quietly, for giving that back to her. After that, he'd started joining them for lessons more regularly. At first, standing by the door, rigid and silent, then gradually moving closer, sitting in chairs, Margaret carefully positioned nearby, watching as she taught Charlotte mathematics through puzzles rather than rote memorization, as she made geography come alive through stories of far-off places, as she encouraged Charlotte to ask questions rather than simply absorbing information passively. "She'll never learn proper discipline if you permit such free-form education," he'd objected one afternoon after Charlotte had spent 20 minutes working through a complex arithmetic problem on her own, talking herself through the steps aloud. "She'll never learn to think independently if she's not allowed to struggle and find her own path to solutions," Margaret had countered. "Watch." They'd both watched as Charlotte's face suddenly lit with understanding. "Oh, I see it now. The answer is 48, because if I group these numbers differently, she'd worked through the entire problem aloud, her confidence growing with each step. Excellent reasoning, darling, Margaret had praised. You found a creative approach I hadn't even considered. Well done. Charlotte had beamed, then turned to Sebastian with barely contained excitement. Did you see, Uncle? I worked it out myself. I saw. Sebastian's voice had been gruff, but his eyes had softened. You did very well indeed. After the lesson, as Charlotte ran to play in the garden under the watchful eye of a nursery maid, Sebastian had lingered. You were right, he'd said abruptly, about letting her think for herself. I've been too rigid in my approach. You've been frightened, Margaret had replied gently. There's a difference. I failed my brother. The words seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him. Thomas asked me to look after Charlotte if anything happened, made me a promise. I was his older brother. I should have protected him, should have insisted he not travel in that storm, should have... He'd stopped, his jaw clenching. And then when he died, and I had Charlotte to care for, I had no idea what I was doing. My father's approach to raising children was all I knew. Strict discipline, high expectations, emotional distance. It made Thomas and me both miserable, but it was the only model I had. Margaret's heart had clenched at the raw pain in his voice. So you tried to control everything you could. Every detail of Charlotte's education, every interaction, every emotion, because if you could just maintain perfect control, then nothing else could go wrong, Sebastian had finished. Then I wouldn't fail her the way I'd failed my brother. They'd stood there in the music room, late afternoon lights slanting through the windows, the piano still open from Charlotte's earlier practicing. The space between them had felt charged with something Margaret couldn't quite name. You haven't failed her, Margaret had said softly. You've loved her the only way you knew how. That's not failure, Sebastian. It's just incomplete. Love needs to be balanced with warmth and understanding and room for mistakes, yours and hers. He'd looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch. How did you get so wise about such things? You're not much older than I am, and you have no children of your own. I had parents who showed me both approaches. My father was distant and demanding, always disappointed when I failed to meet his exacting standards. My mother was warm and encouraging, teaching me that mistakes were opportunities for growth rather than evidence of fundamental unworthiness. Margaret had paused. I learned more from my mother in the years before she died than I ever learned from my father's criticism. Your mother sounds remarkable. She was. I wish you could have known her. Something had shifted in Sebastian's expression. He'd taken a step closer, close enough that Margaret could smell the sandalwood of his cologne, could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. You're quite remarkable yourself, he'd said quietly. You know that, don't you? The way you've transformed Charlotte in just 3 weeks, it's extraordinary. Charlotte was never broken, Sebastian. She was just sad and lonely and desperate for someone to see past her grief to the bright, curious child underneath. Nevertheless, his hand had lifted, as though to touch her face, then dropped back to his side. What you've done, what you're doing, it matters. It matters more than I can adequately express. Margaret's heart had hammered against her ribs. They were standing very close now, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. The air between them felt electric, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Sebastian, she'd whispered, not even sure what she wanted to say. Then Victoria's voice rang out from the corridor. Sebastian, are you in here? I need you to settle a dispute with Mrs. Winters about the Christmas arrangement. They'd sprung apart like guilty children. Victoria had appeared in the doorway, taken one look at them, and smiled with unmistakable satisfaction. Am I interrupting something? Not at all, Margaret had said quickly, her cheeks burning. I was just about to check on Charlotte in the garden. She'd fled before either of them could stop her. That evening, Victoria had cornered Margaret in the library, where she'd retreated with a book she had no hope of actually reading, her mind too full of Sebastian's words and the way he'd looked at her. My dear, Victoria had said, settling into the chair beside Margaret's with the air of someone prepared for a long conversation. I feel we should have a frank discussion. Margaret's stomach had dropped. Your Grace. Oh, do call me Victoria. Your Grace makes me feel ancient. The Dowager Duchess had smiled warmly. I wanted to tell you how grateful I am for what you've done for Charlotte. The change in her is nothing short of miraculous. She's a wonderful child. She simply needed to be seen as such rather than as a problem to be solved. Yes, I'm well aware. Victoria's shrewd eyes had studied Margaret with unnerving perception. I've also observed the change in my son. Heat had crept up Margaret's neck. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Of course you do. You're an intelligent woman, Margaret. You've noticed the way Sebastian looks at you when he thinks no one is watching, the way he finds excuses to be present during lessons, the way his voice changes when he speaks your name, the way he stands just a bit too close when you're discussing Charlotte's progress. Victoria, Margaret had stopped, unsure how to continue, how to explain that yes, she'd noticed all those things, had lain awake at night cataloguing them, turning them over in her mind like precious stones, wondering if she was imagining the shift between them, or if it was real. I'm not criticizing, dear, quite the opposite. Victoria had reached over and patted Margaret's hand. Sebastian has been half dead since he inherited the title 2 years ago. The weight of responsibility, the loss of his brother, the burden of suddenly having to be the Duke when he'd never expected or wanted the role. It crushed something vital in him. He became exactly what he'd sworn he'd never become, a carbon copy of our late Duke, all cold authority and rigid control. Victoria had paused, her expression turning more serious. But you've brought him back to life, Mark. You've made him feel again. You've challenged him and frustrated him and forced him to question his assumptions. And most importantly, you've shown him that love doesn't have to be expressed through distance and discipline. That warmth and connection are strengths, not weaknesses. I'm merely doing my job as Charlotte's governess. You're doing far more than that, and we both know it. Victoria's eyes had twinkled. All I'm saying is that if something were to develop between you and Sebastian, you would have my complete support, and my assistance, should you require it. Nothing can develop, Margaret had said firmly, even as her heart insisted otherwise. The distance between a duke and an impoverished governess is insurmountable. I have no fortune, no connections, nothing to bring to such a union except my education and my determination. Society would be merciless. Nonsense. Sebastian is wealthy enough and powerful enough to marry whom he pleases. He's a duke, not a prince. There are no political alliances that must be maintained through his marriage. The title will pass to him, regardless of whom he marries, and it will eventually pass to his children, again, regardless of who their mother is. Victoria had leaned forward intently. Society will titter and gossip for a season, perhaps 2. They'll call you fortunate, him besotted, the match unsuitable, and then some other scandal will capture their attention, and they'll move on to fresh meat. You make it sound so simple, because it is simple. The complications are all in our heads, constructed from fear and propriety and outdated notions of what's acceptable. Victoria had risen, smoothing her skirts. Besides, love has a way of making the insurmountable suddenly seem quite manageable. You'll see. After she'd left, Margaret had sat in the gathering darkness, her book forgotten in her lap. Love. Was that what this was? This constant awareness of Sebastian's presence, the way her pulse quickened when he entered a room, the warmth that spread through her chest when he smiled at Charlotte, or the sharp ache when his guard slipped and she glimpsed the lonely man beneath the Duke's armour. The way her breath caught when he stood close, when his voice dropped to that intimate register he seemed to reserve for conversations with her, the way she'd started thinking of him as Sebastian rather than your Grace or the Duke, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. It was foolish, dangerous, a path that could only lead to heartbreak. She was his employee, a temporary one at that, here on a 1-month trial that was more than half over. In less than 2 weeks, he would assess her performance, decide whether to keep her on permanently or dismiss her. And even if he did keep her, even if he increased her salary to the promised £45, That didn't change the fundamental reality. She was a governess, and he was a duke. The social chasm between them was real, regardless of what Victoria said. But as Margaret sat there in the library, Sebastian's library, where they'd had that first confrontation, and where they now so often found themselves talking long after Charlotte was in bed, she acknowledged a truth she'd been avoiding. It was already too late to protect her heart. She'd fallen in love with Sebastian Thornfield, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The tension between them grew with each passing day. It was there in every interaction, every conversation, every moment when they found themselves alone. It was there in the brush of fingers when Sebastian handed Margaret a book, the contact lasting just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. In the way his gaze lingered on her face during Charlotte's piano lessons, his eyes tracking the movement of her hands on the keys, the way she tilted her head when listening to Charlotte sing. It was there in the charged silence that fell whenever Victoria or Charlotte left them alone. The air between them, suddenly too thick, too warm, weighted with things neither of them dared to say. One afternoon in mid-December, Margaret made the mistake of venturing outside without her cloak. She'd only meant to collect Charlotte from the garden. The child had been playing with the new kitten the stable master had given her, a tiny tabby thing that Charlotte had named Moonbeam. But the child had run ahead to show Victoria the kitten's new trick, leaving Margaret shivering in the cutting winter wind. She wrapped her arms around herself, her thin wool dress providing inadequate protection against the December chill. She should go back inside, should retrieve her cloak from the hook in the nursery, but she was watching Charlotte race across the lawn, all animation and joy, such a stark contrast to the silent, withdrawn child of 3 weeks ago, and Margaret couldn't quite bring herself to look away from that small miracle. "You'll catch your death," the voice came from directly behind her, so close that Margaret jumped. She turned to find Sebastian striding toward her from the direction of the stables, already shrugging out of his coat. Before she could protest, he draped it around her shoulders. It was heavy and warm, still carrying his body heat. It smelled of sandalwood and leather, and something that was uniquely him, something that made Margaret's pulse quicken, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Thank you," she managed, her voice emerging slightly breathless. He stood very close, his hands still resting on her shoulders where he'd settled the coat. "You should take better care of yourself, Margaret. I'm perfectly capable of—" "I know you're capable. You're the most capable woman I've ever met." His thumbs moved in small circles against her shoulders, the touch burning through the layers of fabric. But even capable women need someone to look after them occasionally, to remind them that their well-being matters. Margaret's breath caught. "Sebastian, I see you, you know." His voice was low, intimate, meant only for her. "I see how hard you work, how you're always putting Charlotte's needs before your own, how you've been wearing the same 3 dresses in rotation because you spent your wages on new clothes for her instead of yourself, how you skip meals sometimes when you're absorbed in preparing lessons. How did you—" "Mrs. Winters reports to me, and I have eyes." His hands tightened fractionally on her shoulders. "You matter, Margaret, not just as Charlotte's governess, but as yourself, as the woman who brought light back into this house, who made me remember what it feels like to be something other than cold and empty." Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." His gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes. "I need you to know that I see you, all of you, and what I see is—" "Uncle Sebastian! Lady Margaret!" Charlotte's voice rang out across the garden, bright with excitement. "Come see!" Moonbeam caught a leaf. They sprang apart like guilty conspirators. Sebastian cleared his throat roughly and stepped back, putting a careful distance between them that felt simultaneously safer and infinitely more painful. "We should," he began. "Yes," Margaret agreed quickly. "Charlotte is waiting." But as they walked toward the child, whose attention had already returned to the kitten, Margaret was acutely aware of Sebastian beside her, of his coat still wrapped around her shoulders, of the words he'd almost spoken. "What I see is—" What? What had he been about to say? What did he see when he looked at her? That night, Margaret lay awake in her narrow bed, Sebastian's coat still draped over her chair where she'd carefully hung it. She should return it. Should have returned it hours ago, during dinner or before bed. Should put proper distance between herself and these dangerous, impossible feelings. Instead, she found herself breathing in its scent, her fingers tracing the expensive fabric and allowing herself, just for these quiet hours between midnight and dawn, to imagine impossible things, to imagine Sebastian looking at her with something more than professional appreciation, to imagine him saying the words he'd cut off, to imagine a world where the distance between a duke and a governess could be bridged by something as simple and powerful as love. It was foolish, it was dangerous, but it was also the sweetest torture Margaret had ever known. The breaking point came 3 days before Christmas. Sebastian had been working long hours in his study, managing year-end business affairs and preparing for the influx of relatives who would descend on Thornfield Park for the holiday season. Margaret saw him only in passing, brief encounters in corridors where their eyes would meet and hold for a heartbeat too long before one of them looked away. At meals, they sat at opposite ends of the long dining table in the formal dining room, making polite conversation with Victoria and Charlotte, while the air between them crackled with unspoken words. Margaret told herself it was for the best, that this distance was necessary, that the strange intimacy they'd begun developing was inappropriate and needed to be curtailed before it went too far. She told herself this very firmly. She almost believed it. Then Sebastian summoned her to his study. The summons came via a footman, just as Margaret was preparing Charlotte for bed. "His Grace requests your presence in his study at your earliest convenience." Margaret's stomach dropped. This was it. Her month was nearly up. He was going to dismiss her, had probably already written her reference letter and calculated her final wages. "Tell His Grace I'll be there directly," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She tucked Charlotte into bed, read her a story, and listened to her prayers. The child was drowsy and content, nothing like the anxious, withdrawn little girl of a month ago. Whatever happened, Margaret told herself, at least she'd given Charlotte this, a month of warmth and laughter and permission to be a child. She made her way to Sebastian's study with her heart in her throat, practicing what she would say when he dismissed her. She would be gracious, grateful for the opportunity. She would not cry, would not beg, would not make this any more difficult than it already was. She knocked. Enter. He was at his desk, as always, surrounded by papers and ledgers. But when he looked up, Margaret saw something in his face that wasn't the cold dismissal she'd been expecting. He looked troubled, uncertain, almost vulnerable. "Margaret, thank you for coming. Please sit." She perched on the edge of the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. "You wish to see me, Your Grace?" "Sebastian," he corrected. "I thought we were past formality when we're alone." "Sebastian," she amended, and felt her heart clench at how familiar his name had become on her tongue. "I've been reviewing the household accounts," he began, his eyes fixed on the papers before him. Specifically, the expenditures related to Charlotte's education and care over the past month. Here it came. He'd discovered she'd been spending her own wages on Charlotte. He'd taken it as overstepping, as inappropriate attachment, as, "You've been spending your salary on my ward," he said quietly. "New dresses, books, art supplies, a music box for her room. You've purchased all of these things yourself rather than submitting expenses to the household accounts as you should have done." Margaret's throat was tight. "I apologize if that was inappropriate, but Charlotte needed those things, and I didn't want to presume you shouldn't have had to use your own money." Sebastian finally looked up, and the emotion in his dark eyes made Margaret's breath catch. "You're here on a salary I now realize was insulting. £20. It's unconscionable. Even the 45 I promised is inadequate for the work you're doing, for the transformation you've brought about. I don't understand. I'm increasing your salary to £70 per annum, effective immediately." He pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. And I'm formally changing your title from companion to governess, with all the respect and authority that position carries in this household. £70. It was generous. More than generous. It was enough to pay off her father's smaller debts, to keep Ashford Manor from foreclosure for another year at least, to give her breathing room to figure out a longer-term solution. It was also a clear boundary, a reminder of what she was, an employee, a valued one certainly, a well-compensated one, but still an employee, not an equal, not someone who belonged in this world beyond the capacity to serve. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. If that's all, Your Grace, I should return to Charlotte. Margaret, wait. Sebastian rose as well, confusion clear in his expression. I thought you'd be pleased. This is significantly better compensation than what you initially offered. Yes, thank you. It's most generous. Her voice was brittle, barely holding together. Is there anything else? Why are you upset? I'm trying to do right by you, to recognize your value. My value as an employee, Margaret interrupted, something breaking loose inside her. My value as someone who performs a service for appropriate compensation. Yes, I understand perfectly, Your Grace. That's not... He moved around the desk toward her. Margaret, that's not what I meant at all. Then what did you mean? Because from where I'm standing, this looks remarkably like you establishing clear boundaries, reminding both of us exactly what our relationship is. Employer and employee, Duke and Governess. Nothing more. Is that what you think? Sebastian's voice had gone rough. That I called you here to establish boundaries, didn't you? No. He took another step toward her, closing the distance between them. I called you here because I've been trying to do the right thing, the proper thing, the thing any reasonable man in my position should do. I've been trying to increase your compensation and formalize your role because you've earned it, because you deserve recognition and security. And he stopped, running a hand through his hair, in a gesture of pure frustration that Margaret had never seen from him before. The Duke's careful control was slipping, and underneath was something raw and real and slightly desperate. And because, he continued, his voice dropping, I've been trying to convince myself that if I just establish the proper professional framework, if I just ensure you're fairly compensated and appropriately titled, then perhaps I can stop feeling what I've been feeling for you. Perhaps I can remember that there's supposed to be a distance between us. Perhaps I can forget that you're the first thing I think about when I wake and the last thing I think about before I sleep. Perhaps I can stop looking for excuses to be in whatever room you're in. Stop engineering these moments alone with you. Stop wanting... He cut himself off, breathing hard. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Stop wanting what? Everything. You. This. He closed the final distance between them in 2 strides. I want everything I shouldn't want. Everything I have no right to want. Because you're my employee, and I'm your employer, and there are rules about such things. Boundaries. Proper behavior. But God help me, Margaret. When you're near me, I can't remember why any of that matters. Sebastian. Her voice emerged as barely a whisper. You think I don't know there's distance between us? His eyes blazed with emotion. You think I haven't catalogued every reason why I should keep away from you? You're in my employ. You've endured hardship and loss. You deserve security and stability, not the complications of an entanglement with your employer. I've listed every rational objection 100 times over. Then why? Margaret couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't push the words past the tightness in her throat. Because none of it matters when you're near me, Sebastian said, his voice rough and honest, in a way she'd never heard from him. Because I think about you constantly. Because Charlotte asks me every morning if I've noticed how pretty you look, and I want to tell her that I notice nothing else, that you're all I see. Because yesterday when you laughed at something she said, I wanted to cross the room and... He stopped again, his jaw clenching. And what? Margaret whispered, her heart racing. This. He kissed her. It wasn't tentative or gentle or careful. It was fierce and desperate and absolutely inevitable, like a storm that had been building for weeks finally breaking. His hands framed her face, tilting it up to his, and Margaret's carefully constructed restraint shattered into 1,000 pieces. She kissed him back with all the longing she'd been suppressing, her fingers clutching at his lapels, her body arching into his as though trying to eliminate every inch of space between them. He made a sound low in his throat, something between a groan and her name, and backed her against the door, his mouth trailing fire along her jaw, down the column of her throat. God, Margaret, he breathed against her skin. I've wanted to do this since the moment you walked into this study and told me I was arrogant, since you challenged me and refused to back down and made me see everything I'd been blind to. Sebastian, we can't... But her protest was weak, undermined by the way her fingers were threading through his hair, by the way she tilted her head to give him better access to her throat. I know. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his dark eyes burning with emotion. I know all the reasons why we can't, but I don't care anymore. I don't care about propriety or boundaries or what's appropriate. I only care about this, about you. Before Margaret could respond, before she could even process what he was saying, the door behind her opened, or tried to open. Margaret stumbled forward, directly into Sebastian's arms, as the door hit her back. Oh my! Victoria's voice came from the other side. Sebastian, is someone blocking the door? They sprang apart. Margaret's hands flew to her hair, trying to smooth it back into some semblance of order. Sebastian's cravat was askew, his hair dishevelled where her fingers had been moments before. Just a moment, mother, Sebastian called, his voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. Margaret straightened her dress with trembling hands and stepped away from the door. Sebastian opened it to reveal Victoria, standing there with an expression of pure delight, barely concealed behind a facade of maternal concern. Oh dear, Victoria said, taking in their dishevelled appearances with obvious satisfaction. I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Mother, Sebastian began, clearly searching for some plausible explanation. Oh, do be quiet, Sebastian. It's exactly what it looks like, and I'm delighted. Victoria stepped into the study and firmly closed the door behind her. Though perhaps next time you might lock it, Mrs. Winters will be through in a moment with the tea service, and I suspect she's less broad-minded than I am about finding you attempting to devour your son's governess against the study door. Margaret wanted the floor to open and swallow her whole. Your Grace, I apologize. This was entirely inappropriate. It was entirely inevitable, Victoria. I've been watching the two of you circle each other like wary cats for 3 weeks. The tension has been positively thick enough to cut with a knife. I'm only surprised it took you this long. Mother, Sebastian said through gritted teeth, your assistance is not required. No. Then you have a plan for what to do about this situation. Victoria settled herself into one of the chairs with the air of someone preparing for a lengthy stay. Because from where I'm standing, you've just compromised your son's governess. And while I personally have no objection to that, indeed I've been encouraging it, I suspect Margaret might have some concerns about her reputation and future prospects. The silence that followed was damning. I thought as much, Victoria said with satisfaction. Very well. Here's what's going to happen. Sebastian, you're going to acknowledge that you've fallen in love with Margaret. Margaret, you're going to acknowledge that you've fallen in love with Sebastian. And then we're all going to discuss how to navigate the practicalities without causing a scandal that will make both your lives miserable. I can't possibly... Margaret began. Love him, Sebastian finished quietly, his eyes finding hers across the study. Because I love you. I've been trying not to. I've been trying to convince myself that what I feel is mere admiration for your skills as a governess, or gratitude for what you've done for Charlotte. But I'm apparently terrible at lying to myself. I love you, Margaret, and I'm done pretending otherwise. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Margaret stared at him, at this proud, difficult man who'd just laid himself bare in front of his mother and God, and anyone who might be listening. Her voice failed. She tried again, her throat tight with emotion. I do love you, but Sebastian, you're a duke. I'm nobody. I have no fortune, no connections, Nothing to bring to such a union except— You brought Charlotte back to life, Sebastian interrupted, crossing to her in 3 strides. You brought me back to life. You brought warmth and laughter and purpose back into this house. If you think fortune and connections outweigh that, then you haven't been paying attention to anything I've said for the past month. He took her hands in his grip warm and steady. Say yes, Margaret. Say you'll have me. Say you'll be my wife and Charlotte's mother and let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. This is all happening very fast, Margaret protested weakly. We've known each other barely a month. We could wait if you prefer. A proper courtship. I could send you flowers and write you terrible poetry. And I do mean terrible. I'm genuinely dreadful at verse, and we could do this in the approved fashion. But Margaret, I've wasted enough time already. I don't want to waste any more. She looked into his dark eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the hope. She thought about Charlotte, who'd already started calling her Mama Margaret when she thought no one was listening. About Victoria, who'd become more of a mother to her in 4 weeks than her own mother had been in the last years of her life. About this house that had somehow become home. And she thought about the alternative, leaving Thornfield Park at the end of her trial month, returning to Ashford Manor and her creditors and the slow grinding poverty that awaited her, never seeing Sebastian again, never watching Charlotte grow and flourish, never knowing what it felt like to truly belong somewhere, to someone. Yes, she said, the word emerging stronger than she'd expected. Yes, I'll marry you. Sebastian's smile was transformative, lighting his entire face with pure joy she'd never seen before. Thank heavens. I was running out of rational arguments. You never had any rational arguments, Victoria said cheerfully from her chair. You had desperation and determination, and a complete inability to admit when you're wrong. But it seems to have worked out. Mother, if you're quite finished— I'm not, actually. Victoria rose. All business now. We need to discuss the practicalities. Margaret, you're an earl's daughter, which helps considerably. The match is unusual, but not scandalous. Sebastian is wealthy enough and powerful enough that society will accept whatever he decides. However, she fixed them both with a stern look. There will be gossip. Some of it will be vicious. You'll need to be prepared for that. I can handle gossip, Margaret said quietly. Can you? Because they'll say you seduced him for his money, that you trapped him with feminine wiles, that you're a fortune hunter who took advantage of his grief and loneliness. They'll question your every motive, your every decision, and they'll make Charlotte's life difficult as well, whispering that her guardian married the governess. Margaret's stomach clenched. I hadn't thought about the effect on Charlotte, which is precisely why we need to manage this carefully, Victoria said. I propose we announce the engagement at the Christmas ball 3 days from now. We'll invite all the local families, make it a proper celebration, show society that this is a love match, not a sordid affair. Sebastian will acknowledge publicly that he pursued you, not the other way around, and I will make it abundantly clear that anyone who dares speak ill of you will answer to me personally. Sebastian squeezed Margaret's hands gently. You don't have to do this. If the scandal would be too much, the scandal will be worth it, Margaret interrupted firmly. If it means I get to keep you, keep Charlotte, keep this life we're building together, then it's settled, Victoria declared. I'll begin preparations for the ball immediately. Margaret, you'll need a proper wardrobe, nothing too elaborate. We don't want to look like we're trying too hard, but something that shows you belong in this world. I can't afford— It's not your expense, dear. You'll be family soon. The family provides. Victoria moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Sebastian? Do try to keep your hands to yourself for the next 3 days. I know it's asking rather a lot, but propriety demands at least a show of restraint. After she left, Sebastian pulled Margaret into his arms, holding her close. Are you certain about this? Once we announce the engagement, there's no going back. I'm certain, Margaret said, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Terrified, but certain. Good, because I have no intention of letting you go. He pressed a kiss to her hair. You're mine now, Margaret Ashford. and I protect what's mine. That night, Margaret lay awake in her narrow bed for the last time, her mind racing with everything that had happened, everything that was about to happen. In 3 days, she would be formally engaged to Sebastian Thornfield, 6th Duke of Thornfield. In a few months, after a proper courtship to quiet the gossip, she would marry him. She would become Charlotte's mother in truth, not just in affection. She would be a duchess. It was terrifying. It was impossible. It was everything she'd never dared to hope for, and it had all started because she'd walked into a duke's study 4 weeks ago, desperate and proud in equal measure, and refused to let him treat her as less than she was worth. Margaret smiled into the darkness. Perhaps desperation wasn't always a weakness. Perhaps sometimes it was exactly the push you needed to fight for something better, to fight for love, even when it seemed impossible, to prove that value wasn't measured in fortune or connections, but in courage and character and the willingness to stand up for what you believed in. She told Sebastian he was wrong about her being desperate and replaceable, and in 3 days, in front of all of society, she would prove it. The 3 days before the Christmas ball passed in a blur of preparation. Victoria descended upon Margaret like a benevolent whirlwind, dragging her to appointments with the modiste, the milliner, the glove-maker. Margaret protested the expense until Victoria fixed her with a look that could have frozen fire. You are about to become the Duchess of Thornfield. You will dress accordingly. This is not charity, Margaret. It's a necessity. Society judges women by their appearance. We'll give them nothing to criticize. The ball gown that emerged from these efforts was breathtaking. Midnight blue silk that made Margaret's skin glow and her eyes seem impossibly deep. It was cut simply but elegantly, with delicate silver embroidery at the neckline and hem that caught the light with every movement. You look like starlight, Sebastian said when he saw her in it during the final fitting. His voice was rough with emotion. I look terrified, Margaret corrected, studying her reflection. That too, but mostly like starlight. He crossed to her, taking her hands. We can still wait if you want. Delay the announcement. Take more time. And give myself more time to panic? No, thank you. Besides, Charlotte is beside herself with excitement. I won't disappoint her. Charlotte had indeed been thrilled when they'd told her about the engagement. She'd launched herself at both of them with enough force to nearly knock them over, chattering about how she'd always known they loved each other, how she'd been hoping this would happen, how she couldn't wait to have Margaret as her proper mamma. The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth, as though December had decided to masquerade as spring. Thornfield Park blazed with light, every chandelier lit, every surface polished to gleaming perfection. Margaret stood in her room, dressed in her midnight blue silk, and tried to calm her racing heart. You can do this, she said in her reflection. You've survived worse. You can survive a few hours of polite conversation. A knock at the door. Then Victoria swept in, magnificent in emerald green. Oh, my dear, you're exquisite. She crossed to Margaret, placing her hands on her shoulders. Listen to me. These people, most of them are fools who follow fashion and gossip because they have nothing of substance in their own lives. But some of them are worth knowing. Focus on those. Ignore the rest. And if there are more fools than worthwhile people, then we'll face them together. We're Thornfields. We don't bow to gossip. I'm not a Thornfield yet. You are in every way that matters. Victoria squeezed her shoulders. Now come. Sebastian is waiting, and if I know my son, he's wearing a hole in the carpet. Sebastian was indeed pacing when they descended to the main hall. He turned as they approached, and the expression on his face made every anxiety worth it. You're... He seemed to have forgotten how words worked. Adequate? Margaret supplied. Devastating. Absolutely devastating. He offered his arm. If I didn't have 200 guests arriving momentarily, I'd lock you in my study and spend the evening convincing you to elope. Your mother would never forgive us. Probably not. Shall we face the lions? Margaret took her place beside Sebastian at the entrance to the ballroom, acutely aware of curious glances from arriving guests, whispers that started the moment people saw her standing beside the Duke. The first guests were warm, longtime friends of Victoria who greeted Margaret with genuine smiles. But then came Lord and Lady Hartwell, and with them, Lady Helena Winters. Helena was beautiful in a brittle way. Perfect features, flawless complexion, and eyes like chips of ice. She'd been widely assumed to be Sebastian's eventual choice for Duchess before Margaret's arrival. Now she looked Margaret up and down with barely concealed venom. "How quaint," Helena said, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearby. "The governess playing at Duchess. How very novel." The insult hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Margaret felt Sebastian tense beside her, but before he could respond, she said calmly, "How kind of you to come, lady. I do hope you enjoy the evening." It was perfectly polite, perfectly neutral, and it made Helena's rudeness all the more obvious. Lady Hartwell flushed with embarrassment. "How gracious of you, Lady Margaret," Lady Hartwell said pointedly to her daughter. "My daughter sometimes forgets her manners when nursing disappointed expectations." Victoria beamed. Sebastian's hand tightened on Margaret's arm in silent approval. Helena, outmaneuvered, had no choice but to move along. "Well played," Sebastian murmured once they were out of earshot. "She's not the first person to look down on me. I've had practice." The receiving line continued. Some guests were warm, some neutral, some clearly disapproving, but none dared be as overtly rude as Helena. Not with Sebastian and Victoria flanking Margaret like protective sentries. Finally, the last guest arrived. The orchestra began to play. Sebastian turned to Margaret. "May I have this dance, my lady?" "I suppose you must. It would look odd if you didn't dance with your own fiancé. I would dance with you if you were a scullery maid." He led her onto the floor as 200 pairs of eyes tracked their movement. "Though I confess, this dress makes me want to do considerably more than dance." "Sebastian," Margaret hissed, feeling her cheeks heat. "Behave." "I'm always behaving. It's deeply boring." The music swelled, and they began to waltz. Margaret felt every eye in the room watching, judging, speculating. "Everyone's staring," she whispered. "Let them watch. Let them see how perfectly you fit in my arms. How completely in love I am. You're going to make me cry. Please don't. I need you to be intimidatingly beautiful for at least another 2 hours." Despite everything, Margaret laughed, and in that moment, with Sebastian's arms around her and his eyes warm with love, the rest of the room seemed to fade away. The dance ended with polite applause. Margaret was immediately claimed by a succession of partners, some dancing with her out of curiosity, others out of genuine warmth. She moved through it all in a daze, hyper-aware of Sebastian's gaze tracking her around the room. During a break between sets, Victoria appeared with champagne. "You're doing splendidly. Lady Pembroke told me at least 6 women have commented on how lovely and gracious you are. And the others? Helena's been spreading poison in corners, suggesting you seduced Sebastian for his fortune. But I think the general consensus is shifting in your favour. You're winning them over." Later, as supper was announced, Sebastian appeared to escort Margaret to the dining room. But before they could move, Helena stepped deliberately into their path. "Your Grace, I wonder if I might claim a moment. There's a matter concerning the parish charity that requires discussion." It was a clever move. Sebastian could hardly refuse without appearing rude. But before he could respond, an elderly woman in magnificent purple silk appeared. "Lady Helena, how delightful. I've been meaning to ask your opinion on a matter of utmost importance." The Duchess of Pemberton was society's most formidable arbiter. Her approval could make or break a reputation. "Your Grace," Helena said, unable to hide her surprise. "Yes, hello. Tell me. I've heard extraordinary rumours about you spreading gossip concerning the Duke's engagement. You couldn't possibly be that foolish, could you? To speak ill of a grieving widower's choice of bride, especially when that bride is an earl's daughter with impeccable lineage." Helena's face went white, then red. "I'm sure I don't know." "Oh, I think you do. Run along. I wish to speak with the engaged couple." Helena fled. The Duchess turned to Margaret with a satisfied smile. "There. That should end that nonsense. Now, Lady Margaret, I hear you're an accomplished musician. I do hope you'll perform after supper. I'd be honoured, Your Grace. Excellent. I'm quite fond of putting young upstarts in their place. And you, my dear, deserve to be happy. She looked between them. Both of you do. The ball continued until well past midnight. By the time the last guest departed, Margaret was exhausted but elated. Sebastian pulled her into his arms in the entrance hall. Tired? Beyond. But happy. Good. Because I have something for you. He led her to his study where documents waited. The mortgages on Ashford Manor, all paid in full. The house is yours again. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. Sebastian, this is too much. It's nothing compared to what you've given me. Hope, laughter, love. A future I'd stopped believing was possible. He cupped her face. I love you, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this emotional journey. If you were moved by Margaret and Sebastian's story, by the transformation of pride into love, by Charlotte's laughter, and by the kind of love that breaks down every wall, then please show your support by liking, commenting, and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement keeps these stories alive and helps them reach more hearts. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever walked away from someone who underestimated you? Another sweeping historical tale is waiting for you next. Until then, may you know your worth and never settle for less.